Hello, and welcome to the American Revolution, Part 1. So let's first go over some vocabulary. Number 1, to enlist is to agree to serve in an army or navy. 2, home front, areas away from the fighting in a country at war. 3, mercenary, a soldier hired to fight for a foreign army, meaning not their own country. 4, revolution, the overthrow of one government and its replacement with another. Number 5, strategy, an overall plan for winning a war. Number 6, tactic, a plan of action. Make sure not to confuse these two. Number 7, treaty, a formal agreement between two or more nations. Number 8, a turning point, an event that leads to a dramatic change. And number 9, volunteer, a person who performs a service for free. Very brief introduction about the American Revolution. It took place between 1775 to 1783, and Great Britain was the favorite to win since they had a huge and well-trained army and navy. The Americans, or the Continental Army as they called it, was very small and untrained. So the biggest question is, how exactly did the Continental Army win? And we're going to go over the battles, the plans, and the reasons for the fighting. The Continental Army. They didn't have one. When the Revolution started, there was no army in the States. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress asked George Washington to lead a new army. This was full of volunteers, and most were farmers, merchants, and workers, and they only enlisted for about a year at a time in order to go back and be with their families. There was anywhere between 8,000 to 24,000 men in Washington's army at one time. This included the African Americans and American Indians that wanted to help out. We also had women that would help as well. They cooked, they fixed uniforms, and they cared for the sick and wounded, and some of them even fought in battle. The Continental Army did face a few challenges and problems. The very first and one of the biggest was that there was no money. So the soldiers could not be paid a lot, they were short on supplies, and there was not a lot of weapons. In addition, they weren't very trained. But George Washington worked very hard. He taught them how to obey orders, how to fight, alone and together, and he encouraged them more than anything. Our Navy was even smaller than our Army. The ships were mostly made out of trade and fishing ships and only carried a few cannons at a time. Now let's talk about the British Army. The British Army started off with this great confidence. They were one of the strongest military forces in the world during this time. They had 270 warships and even built 200 more for their navy during the American Revolution. They were large and they were well trained. They had so many people involved. The soldiers were full-time, they were experienced, and they were disciplined very harshly. Money was not a problem for the British Army. They were able to have nice uniforms. Every soldier had a musket and bayonet. When it came to their size, there was about 48,000 soldiers in the British Army, and they even had 30,000 mercenaries from Germany. In addition to this, the British Army had many American Indians that joined them as well because they protected their land, as well as the loyalists that were in the colonies from New York, South, and North Carolina. The British Army was super far from home, and because of this, they had a few problems. The trip from Great Britain to America could take about 3 months and was over 3,000 miles. So that meant that it took a long time for the supplies to get there, for orders to be sent, and even for new soldiers to come. But sometimes smaller was better. Even though the Continental Army had very small ships in comparison to the Navy ships that the British had, they had these small boats that were called privateers, and these were used to be able to attack the British supply ships, and the Continental Army would keep the goods for themselves. Eventually, the French came along and helped us out with their warships that attacked the British warships. Also, the Continental troops were home, so it was easy for them to get supplies because not only were they near them, but because the citizens gave them food and supplies as well if there was not enough money. Also, whatever they captured, the Continental Army would keep for themselves, like cannons and muskets. And lastly, the women continued to help out. They would bring supplies, they would make uniforms, they were nurses, and they were also spies for the Continental Army. You should never underestimate a strong motivation or desire to win. The Continental Army believed that they were fighting to defend their rights that were written in the Declaration of Independence. There was a turning point, which was the Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. It was the winter of 1777 to 1778. The U.S. had no warm clothing or shoes, and about 3,000 men died from cold and sickness. But the rest did not give up. During this time, or during the war, the British Army fought because it was their job. They weren't defending their home or freedom like the Continental Army was. They also had to defend other colonies that were outside of the US. And people in Great Britain did not want to pay for the war. Lastly, not all Americans wanted to fight the British. You had your loyalists that didn't want to fight because they didn't believe they needed independence. You had some slaves that were promised their freedom if they fought alongside the British. And again, you had your American Indians that fought along them because their land was protected due to the British. And that is where we're going to end for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 of the American Revolution.